My name is Bansi Malde. I'm a lecturer in the School of Economics, and today I'll be talking to you about my research on how features of informal groups affect how well they can protect households from risk. Risk is very prevalent in low-income settings. Most of these households tend to be engaged in subsistence, rain-fed agriculture, and as a result, they're subject to the vagaries, their livelihoods are subject to the vagaries of the weather. Moreover, illness rates tend to be quite high, and households also suffer from unexpected employment loss, fires, business losses, thefts, and so on. However, they also have few savings or access to formal credit and insurance markets that they can use to cope with the consequences of risk. Government safety nets, social safety nets, tend to be quite poor, unlike in Western economies. So how do households cope with risk? They cope primarily using informal arrangements. So this could be informal gifts, loans, and transfers that they make with social contacts such as friends, family, and neighbors, or informal institutions such as savings groups. The way these informal arrangements tend to work, they rely on some sort of implicit quid pro quo. So I help you today with the implicit understanding that you will help me in the future when I need help. So these arrangements require quite a lot of trust, or the availability of an effective way of enforcing them. And a type of group which can succeed or which can deliver this, which satisfies these conditions, is extended family and kinship groups. And these tend to be quite important in providing this type of informal insurance. Now, a lot of past evidence in economics has shown that these informal mechanisms or the informal arrangements do a pretty good job at providing insurance. Households are not really hand to mouth. However, they're also not perfectly insured from all this risk. In particular, in my research, I consider that characteristics of these informal groups will affect the amount of insurance they can provide. And studying, it's important then to understand who it is that's not well insured in order to identify where policy intervention would be most effective. So in research I've been conducting with Emla Fitzsimons and Marcos Vera Hernandez at UCL, we've studied one very important feature of informal risk-sharing groups or risk-sharing groups in general, and this is group size. On the one hand, a larger group can better diversify risk and as a result provide better insurance. Why? In a larger group, it's highly unlikely that every member of a group gets the same type of shock. This is not the case for a smaller group. However, when we consider informal arrangements, larger groups face one important vulnerability. In particular, subgroups that attain a high shock or a positive shock, so this would be a positive windfall, might decide, let's leave those guys who didn't get a positive windfall. We don't need to share any of what we've got with them. Let's instead eat it all ourselves, or let's consume it all ourselves. And in the future, if you need help, I'll help you, and if I need help, you can help me, so we can help each other. This type of possibility might destabilize a large group, or it might affect or reduce the amount of insurance that the group can provide. So as a result, from theory, this relationship between group size and the amount of insurance it can provide is unclear. To make progress on understanding the direction of the relationship, we look at data instead. We focus specifically on data from Mchinji district in Malawi. It's a long country, and Mchinji district, which is shaded in red, is the one in the middle. And like much of Malawi, Mchinji consists of poor rural communities, and households rely primarily on rain-fed agriculture for their livelihoods. We thus focus on understanding how households protect themselves against these in our work. Specifically, in our data, we see that roughly about 24% of all households experience some type of a crop loss over a 2-year period. And these crop losses are non-negligible in magnitude. The average loss accounts for roughly about 5 weeks' worth of household consumption. Moreover, financial markets are really not well developed in this setting. Across Malawi in 2008, only 20% of Malawians had a bank account, and fewer than 5% had any type of insurance, and most of these would actually be living in urban areas. So then, what is the risk-sharing group? In this context, it's the main source of support turns out to be the extended family. And we can show this by looking at data on transfers made and received by households. And this graph plots the transfers that are made and received from family, that's on the left panel, and friends on the right panel. And the height of the bars indicates that households tend to make and receive roughly three times as many transfers from family relative to those from friends. So extended family support is quite key. Now, it turns out that we can refine our measure of insurance group or informal insurance group a bit further. Roughly about 90% of residents in Mchinji belong to the Chewa ethnic group. Now, the Chewa are traditionally matrilineal, meaning that assets, so land and so inheritance, occurs through the female line, and matrilocal, meaning that the husband moves to the wife's household on marriage. And in this setting, individuals there seem to be close bonds between siblings, even after marriage. In particular, traditional, well-documented norms indicate that a woman's brothers play a key role in supporting her family. The eldest brother is responsible for providing productive resources and also health care for her family and for supporting general well-being. As a result, brothers of the wife, they should be important for risk sharing. Now, over time, some of these customs have weakened while others have persisted. For our interest in understanding risk sharing, we considered data from another source, which is the Malawi Family Transfers Project, which collected information on transfers between siblings. So we plot this here in this graph. The left panel shows transfers received and sent to the brothers of the wife, whereas the right panel shows those from and to sisters of the wife. The blue bar indicates transfers sent, and the red bar transfers received. So there are two important takeaways from this graph. First, we see quite clearly that brothers of the wife send a lot more in transfers compared to what they receive. The second is that sisters of the wife really don't provide as much help in terms of informal transfers. So this norm that brothers should help take care of their sisters still seems to persist here. So based on this, we define our key risk-sharing group according to brothers and sisters of the wife, and we also do this for the husband. Though our focus will be really on brothers of the wife. So this graph here shows our main findings. So we consider how well protected a household's consumption is following an adverse crop loss for two measures of crop loss. The first is whether or not it occurred, so this would be the incidence, and the second is how intense it was, so how large a loss was experienced. The left panel shows the results of how household protection against these adverse crop losses varies or differs by the number of brothers of the wife, and for the measure of incidence, and the right panel does the same, but for intensity. Both of these panels indicate that for households who have less than 2 brothers of the wife, their consumption is more or less protected following an adverse crop loss. This we can see by the fact that their consumption does not really seem to change. For households with more than 2 brothers of the wife, we see that there is a reduction in their consumption following an adverse crop loss, which indicates that they're less well insured following the crop loss. Now, a concern is that perhaps this negative relationship we've seen is simply a fact that larger families or households with larger extended families might be poor, and poor families tend to be more vulnerable to adverse events. So we might simply be capturing an effect of poor families being worse off. However, we can alleviate these concerns by looking at what happens for sisters of the wife. Remember, for this group, they don't really provide much insurance, and so if we did find this type of negative effect there, it suggests that this is probably not because of worse insurance. So we repeat the same exercise we had before, now for the group for sisters of the wife. And what we see is that even as the number of sisters of the wife increase, we don't really see reductions in consumption. This is very reassuring and suggests to us that what we found for brothers of the wife is really telling us something about the effects of group size. So what are the key takeaways? First, larger informal groups need not always be more effective in providing insurance following an adverse shock. Second, extended family networks don't always protect households against adverse shocks in developing countries. And thus, there is a role for governments and other actors to intervene through policy intervention to counteract these effects. Thank you for listening.